The celestial mandala of service accompanies you to discover the ninth constellation of the wheel of the zodiac that we call Sagittarius, associated with the service field of telepathy, a capability that will characterize communication in the new era. Welcome to this ninth episode of this cycle of podcasts dedicated to human service fields. And this month, in the sign of Sagittarius, we'll be focusing on the field of telepathy and how we might imagine a new way of communicating in the new era of human life. My name is Lorraine Flower, and I'm a member of the community of Living Ethics and your host for this podcast today. Sagittarius is a fire sign and could be called a beam of directed, focused light. In this, the point of light becomes the beam, revealing a greater light ahead and illuminating the way to the center of the light. The fire is related to the fire of the spiritual soul, the fire of the mind, the fire that transforms and purifies. When we think of the arrow associated with Sagittarius, we also think of the higher goal and the aspiration to reach ever new heights. Sagittarius is often regarded as a sign of intuition, where the invocative fires of aspiration evoke the returning arrow of intuition. In Sagittarius, the intellect, which has been developed, used, and finally illuminated, becomes sensitive to a still higher type of mental experience. And this is what we give the name of intuitive perception. So, as we explore the topic of telepathy for the new era, we're invited to consider how we might access our intuition and connect to higher streams of consciousness, and then anchoring them here on Earth as new ideas and new ways of living. So to help us reflect on this topic of telepathy, I'd like to welcome back our guest, Marina Bernardi, a psychologist and psychotherapist and president of the Community of Living Ethics here in Umbria, Italy. So welcome, Marina. We're delighted that you're able to join us for this podcast on this subject of telepathy. And as we know, or as hopefully our listeners will know, that telepathy is one of the phenomena that is studied by parapsychology as a psychic faculty for transmitting or perceiving thoughts, images, messages, without the use of our usual senses, the things that we rely on every day. And this is perhaps not an area that people think about a lot. So how can you help us to understand the value of telepathy for us as human beings, for people in general? What is that value of telepathy?
So we can start from the meaning of the word telepathy itself, which comes from the prefix tele, which means far, and pathos, which means that inner state of deep feeling, intense feeling. Therefore, in telepathy, the feeling is involved, and we will see how. Telepathy is a possible modality of communication among human beings, which bases on the fact that behind or beyond apparent differences, in reality we are one. The distance which is perceived between humans, between human beings, has been very functional, very useful, so that we could arrive to distinguish from each other and to discover our own separate identity. In simple words, in order to become individuated, that process of individuation, become individuals. But this process of differentiation has brought with itself also its own excesses or failures or mistakes, which can be expressed through the concept of separativity. Separativity is not something natural, and therefore it limits very strongly the potentialities of human beings, of human psyche. Potentialities which would instead be very natural. And telepathy is one of the natural potentialities of the human psyche, still to be completely known, accepted, and applied. Therefore, we have to develop it, but it's a natural potentiality of human psyche, of our psychic structure. And we can distinguish 3 levels of telepathy. It's important to have sufficiently clear this distinction so that we can orient ourselves when we could, in case that we have experiences of telepathy, that we can understand what level of telepathy it is about. The first level of telepathy is, we could name it instinctual, because it bases on a perception which comes from the sphere of instincts or of the simplest and more direct emotions connected with our animal part, that part of human being which comes from animal. In this category of telepathic phenomena, we find all those perceptions about what is about to happen to people, to dear people, for example, people who are connected with us. An example of it is the mother who feels the needs of her child. This is an instinctual telepathy. And this kind of telepathy functions also in animals. For example, when a dog perceives the fear of a person and reacts to this fear. And this kind of telepathy works through the solar plexus. Then we have a second kind of telepathy, which is the mental telepathy. It's when a transmission, a telepathic transmissions, happens between 2 minds which exchange thoughts which are clean from emotional contents. An example of this is when on the planet a discovery happens, is done, a discovery is there on one point of the planet, and the same discovery is there, happens in a very far other part of the planet. And so it looks like the same discovery is done simultaneously in different places and by different people. This is an aspect of mental telepathy, an example of mental telepathy. And then we have as third level the spiritual telepathy, which is the soul telepathy, the telepathy between souls. And we have this kind of telepathy when the contact starts directly between the souls, and the souls exchange in this way their visions, their subtle contacts, their purposes, and so all the higher aspects of the human consciousness. While in the first case of the instinctual telepathy, the object of the exchange are emotions and sensations, in the other 2 cases, the object is a thought, is formulated through a thought. And in the case of the mental telepathy, it's a rational thought, and in the case of the spiritual telepathy, is an intuitive thought. But in both cases, telepathy is based on waves that someone emits and someone receives. And so we can say that also there is another distinction to be made, which is the fact that telepathy can happen both spontaneously and unconsciously, or it can be consciously and voluntarily activated when someone makes the decision to transmit certain contents to someone else. One example of this conscious telepathy is what happens between the guides of humanity, the masters, who send out higher thoughts so that they can be received by servers ready and open to receive them. Obviously, this kind of reception requires a disciplined preparation and the capacity to attune with the source, plus the fact that the motivations have to be kindred to the ones of the emitting pole. So if a master sends out high thoughts so that they can be received by servers, the motivation of the server has to be based on the common good, so as the motivation of the source of the transmission. Another important aspect of telepathy is that in order for it to happen, it's necessary to have available a field of love. In fact, it's only love, the energy that makes the field sufficiently coherent and compact so that the waves, the thought waves, can cross that field. Love has this function to prepare the field for telepathy. Telepathy can never be there if love is not there, because love is that energy which allows the transmission of the waves of thoughts. And a test about this is the fact that in a group, when a group is particularly integrated and when there is a good cohesion, those moments of group love, when really the group works well together, the telepathic phenomena are increased. They increase, they multiply, because the field is suitable. Another important distinction is between horizontal telepathy and vertical telepathy. Horizontal telepathy is there when the one who transmits and the one who receives share about the same level of frequency. Therefore, they are similar for level of maturity and evolution. While the vertical telepathy is there when there is a difference between the frequency of the transmitter and the frequency of the receiver. In this case, the information received represents always a good stimulation and a kind of inner gift which can support a further development of the receiver, which allows a passage in his or her growth, and obviously in the measure in which the consciousness is able to absorb the vibration of what it receives, because in the vertical telepathy, the point is how much the receiver is able to absorb of a higher vibration which is transmitted, of a thought of higher vibration which is transmitted by a higher source.
So Marina,
yes.
You've given us many thoughts so far, and I know you have other things to share with us. And I was just as I was listening to this diverse range of information, I was thinking that the question that might be on the minds of some of our listeners is what the value of the telepathy is. So when we think about the emotional telepathy and the mental telepathy, and you spoke about ideas being generated in one place and another place around the world simultaneously, I'm just wondering whether you have a perspective on why we as humans have this capacity for telepathy. What is it serving? What purpose is it serving for us as we evolve as a humanity?
As I said before, telepathy is based on the real fact that we are one, even if we perceive ourselves as different one from the other. And telepathy has the power to make possible for us to really experience that we are one. And it allows to work much better together. We can cooperate much more easily because we go spontaneously towards the same goals, because we perceive them telepathically and we exchange them telepathically. For example, in a group, telepathy allows to come much faster to make a common decision in a group, because telepathically we can exchange the same ideas. And therefore, if we can imagine on the planet, in the humanity of the future, when telepathy will be developed much more than what it is now, how much easier it will be communication, a spontaneous and fluid communication, which doesn't need to have technical instruments, because obviously today we have all the social, all our instruments of communication, which are, we have the experience that they are very, very fast. But telepathy can be even faster, and we don't run the risk with telepathy to become dependent on the technical tool, on the technical instrument. And the transmission, therefore, can remain much cleaner, much purer, much simpler. And this will be a big facilitation to create right human relationships.
It's interesting because you mentioned as part of your opening that love has to be present for telepathy to really become developed. And I sense from what you're saying, and agree with what you're saying, that telepathy is something we're all capable of at some level. I'm wondering how you would encourage us to develop our capacity, our capability in telepathy. So how, if we were interested in advancing our own capabilities. Any thoughts on what we should be paying attention to, or how we could be doing that as individuals?
First of all, I would say that it's very important that we learn to observe and to recognize every time in which a telepathic phenomena happens in a spontaneous way. Because if we begin recognizing when it happens, then we are encouraged to develop it more. And we become much more sensitive to it. Because, if we have a capability, a capacity, and we are not aware to have it, we cannot utilize it. While when we become aware of when it happens, then it's easier for us to multiply that experience. Plus, if we feel attracted from telepathy, we could really try to do experiments with systematic observations of the results, like naming one person who is the transmitter, one person who is the receiver, and, for example, agreeing that at the same time, at the same hour of the day, a word will be transmitted, and checking what the receiver will perceive. This is very interesting. I have been part in the past of this kind of experiments, and it's interesting because sometimes the receiver received not exactly the same word, but a synonym, a word which expresses the concept that was intended to be transmitted. And therefore, if experiments are performed for a sufficiently long time and with constance and trust, slowly they bring for sure good results. Therefore, there is a spontaneous way to train in telepathy, which is above all observing when it happens, and trusting that it can happen, and also trying to cultivate with other people a good feeling, nourishing the interpersonal field with love, and this facilitates telepathy. Or the second method, which is the one to do active experiments.
Yeah, it's interesting because I can think about various things that have gone on in the world where that sense of connection has been established through experiments like that, and people will be familiar with things like the concept of the 100th monkey or the tipping point, where the idea has gathered sufficient cohesion independently and yet come together as a connection point. My final question before I ask you for a summary thought, but my other question is, if we were to connect telepathy as a practice, as a form of communication, with the idea of service, of being of service, of giving service, in what way is telepathy connected with the idea of service? Does it have a role there?
Yes, as I said before, as it facilitates a lot cooperation in a group or also among groups. If there is a telepathic connection, we will be spontaneously in agreement about what we have to do, and we will be able to work together without needing many words to explain, but we will understand each other in a more direct way. And this will accelerate any project and will improve cooperation for sure. I believe that telepathy will be in the future, hopefully it will be an instrument of cooperation. If we imagine if a telepathic relationship would be there among nations, for example, the governments of different nations could be in agreement very easily because they already met on the subtle level and they crossed their thoughts and their ideas, their projects. Therefore, it will be all the communication system will be much easier.
Yeah. No, I can see that. Marina, I feel this is a subject, like many of our subjects, where we could spend many hours exploring each of the ideas you have offered us today. If you were to leave our listeners with one thought, maybe a phrase or an idea that would be useful to them in their everyday reflection on this subject of telepathy, is there a summary thought that you would leave us with, thinking about that Sagittarius arrow that goes directly to the point?
I would say, let's go from the telematic network to the telepathic network, which will be much cleaner, much easier, and much more free, leaving people free and not becoming dependent on technical objects.
Wonderful, yes.
Therefore, from the telematic communication to the telepathic communication.
So there's a good mantra for us if we think about how we can achieve that. For now, Marina, thank you so much for your time, as always, and I'm sure we'll be talking to you again, but on behalf of all of our listeners, I'm going to say thank you very much for joining us today and for sharing your wisdom on this subject.
Thank you, Lorraine.
This podcast was offered by the Community of Living Ethics, Umbria, Italy, and freely inspired by Aldebaran, the community's Astrosophy group, and by our research on service.